I'm Emily Geddes.
I'm Meredith Hutchison-Hartley.
I'm Frank Hutchison.
And welcome back to the Hidden History of Business podcast. Today we're continuing our series on women's work and women in business history by talking about
Mary Anning. Meredith and I both have a background in theater, and one of the things that you do in theater to warm up, to get your mouth ready to articulate, is to use tongue twisters.
Which are sadistic tools.
Oh,
yes.
They are.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the more famous tongue twisters is She Sells Seashells on the Seashore. And it goes on for a little while after that. But until doing the research for this podcast, I did not know that that tongue twister was based on a real person.
Oh, really? Who?
Her name is Mary Anning. And Mary Anning came from a very disadvantaged background in the southern part of England, right along the coast. She was poor, she was working class as a woman, and as a member of a religious minority in England, she had pretty much the whole deck stacked against her. But she made some of the most important fossil discoveries of the early 1800s, at a time when women were excluded from scientific circles. She heavily influenced the nascent fields of geology and paleontology. She's a pretty incredible woman. I'm excited to talk about her today.
Well, it was also an interesting time when this was happening because you had the French Revolution, which totally changed the political structure in Europe, and that was followed by the Napoleonic Wars. Well, really, they were just a continuation of it, but that also meant that England couldn't import grain from France, which was their breadbasket. So you started having food shortages in England, and prices rose. In fact, the price of wheat, I think, rose by a factor of 3.
Wow.
Just imagine that if all of a sudden gasoline, which is kind of low right now, all of a sudden tripled in price, what effect that would have on our economy.
Okay, well, let's give a little sense of time. We haven't really set out the time frame yet. French Revolution was 1789 to 1799. Mary Anning was born in 1799. And then the Napoleonic Wars were 1803 to 1815.
Well, yes, but you kind of have to say that the French Revolution then became the empire, with
right.
Napoleon becoming the emperor, and there was a brief gap when no one was fighting because Napoleon was consolidating his power, and then, of course, you had everyone gang up on France because France was trying to take over everybody, and they were essentially doing pretty good until they weren't.
So one of the effects of this long period of conflict in France was that the British upper class no longer went there for vacation.
That's right. We talked earlier about honeymoons. People go on a honeymoon. Well, that was really to go visit, relatives, or they would also go to France or
take
to
the
Italy.
grand tour of Europe, which was hitting major European cities. That's the whole idea of the continental breakfast, was from traveling from England to the continent.
Yes, and that's the type of breakfast you'd have on the continent, not in England. But what you had is, as a result of not being able to go to France because you're at war with them, is the upper class had to go somewhere else, and the best place to go was the southern part of England, especially to the coast. You go there for the waters. You read a lot about that in Georgette Heyer's, romance novels.
I just want to say I love that my 60-odd-year-old father just referenced a Georgette Heyer novel. That fills my heart with glee. I appreciate that.
We are nothing if not eclectic.
Well, we were just in the process of reorganizing our library at home, so I got to see a lot of those. When you go on holiday, what do? You always get something to remember the holiday with. We went to Yellowstone, and my wife came back with 2 coffee mugs with bears on the side of them.
And people in Regency England did exactly the same thing.
That's right. They would pick up curiosities. And those curiosities quite often were fossils. You started having the upper class get these collections of fossils.
So backing up a little, let's talk specifically about Mary Anning and her family. Now, as I said before, she was born on the southern coast of England in a small town called Lyme Regis. She was born in May 21st, 1799. There were 10 children born to her parents, Richard and Molly, only 2 of whom managed to live to adulthood.
Wow.
Mary was actually named after her older sister, the firstborn child, who, when she was 4 or 5, was horribly burned in an accident at home and passed away shortly before Mary was born. And is not an uncommon practice in that time. She was named after her sister who had passed away. But anyways, they were a poor family. Her father was a cabinet maker and a carpenter, and they were not members of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, which was the majority church the state church of the time. They were instead dissenters. The church that they were in eventually became Congregationalist, yes.
Now, how is that different from the Church of England? Well, and that's important because the Church of England is a very hierarchical church. It's centralized power connected to the throne in many cases.
Right.
And Congregationalists are straight up the opposite of that. They're local congregations where the congregation has the majority of the power to determine how the church will be run, what the policies will be. They were very much iconoclasts in that sense. They weren't participating in the structured system of the hierarchy.
In a lot of ways, they were outsiders. They were disadvantaged. But they had this one advantage in that they lived in this area that, as we've already discussed, became an upper-class tourism hotspot. One of the reasons for that, one of the advantages that they had, was the unique geological formations along the southern coast of England. There were these impressive cliffs, this formation called Blue Lias, which is limestone and shale layers that dated back to the Jurassic period, about 200 million years ago. This Blue Lias was full of fossils. Now, most of these fossils were called ammonites. They're those coiled, spiral, shell-looking things that were from marine mollusks of 200 million years ago. We'll put a picture on the website of it, but they'll look familiar. They'll look like what you think of as a fossil. But there were also other curiosities there that we'll discuss in detail later that were absolutely revolutionary in helping people understand what the world looked like millions and millions of years ago. And this was beneficial for the family simply because they were poor. Their father, as his carpenter, was not able to make a whole lot of money to take care of the family, but they had this source, this easy access to these curiosities that rich people were willing to pay money for, and so they took advantage of it. Richard, the father, would take the kids, particularly Mary, and her older brother, who also lived, Joseph, on walks along the beach with him by these cliffs to collect these fossils that he taught them how to clean them, how to separate the fossil from the rest of the rock, and to sell them to the tourists that came by. And that was a way that they supplemented their income.
And that's really interesting. I hear echoes of that from our New Shoe episode about the commercialization of history, where you have an economically disadvantaged area, particularly where women didn't have as many economic opportunities, and they're finding ways to survive and to change their economic circumstances through tourism.
Now, one quirky little story that I found from Mary Anning's childhood that I just wanted to share because it's kind of fun. Well, I don't know if fun's the right word, but when she was 15 months old, there was an equestrian performance of some kind in the town. A woman was taking care of her, and she and two other women were standing under this tree watching this performance, holding Mary Anning. And then lightning struck the tree. The three adult women were instantly killed by the lightning, but Mary Anning was able to be revived.
Wow.
Now, her family said this produced a miraculous change in her, that before she'd been a sickly and a shy child, and after being hit by the lightning, she was bright and intelligent and curious, and became the Mary Anning that we all know and love.
Which may have just a smidgen of marketing in
Oh.
it. Just a teensy bit.
Maybe just a little bit.
Struck by lightning.
Yes. But going along with Mary Anning's childhood being disadvantaged, her father died when she was 11. They may have been poor before that, but after, life became an even greater struggle for them. Mary Anning was mostly self-educated. She learned to read and write in her Congregationalist Sunday school class. She didn't really go to any formal schooling beyond that. So at this point, she's 11. Her father has passed away. Her mom kind of takes over this fossil business and tries to make a go of it as much as they can. So Mary and Joseph are out searching for the fossils and cleaning them up. And her mother is running the business side of trying to sell them. But it's a rough life there for a while.
And this is important because at this time frame, about the only work that a lower class woman could get was either as a domestic help or a field labor or something menial like that.
So Mary's dad died when she was 11. It was actually a combination of tuberculosis, which he had been suffering from for quite a while, but also as the result of a fall while he was collecting fossils. Now, this was pretty dangerous work because this limestone and shale are not the hardest rocks. And the best time to go searching for fossils was after a heavy rain, when whole chunks of the cliffs would erode away or fall away. And he happened to get caught up and fall at one of these times that was great for fossil collecting.
Like a landslide.
Yeah, a landslide. Definitely a dangerous kind of line of work. Now, eventually, Joseph actually became apprenticed to an upholsterer, so he was not as available to help with the fossil searching. It really fell mostly on Mary at that point. And by 1820 or so, Mary was essentially running the business. She'd kind of taken over the reins from her mother. Now, Meredith is going to talk a little bit more about the importance of these fossils and at the time, kind of what the popular thinking was about.
We've got to realize that when Mary is functioning, so say 1811, when she's really starting to pick up and function more in the business, Charles Darwin is only 2 years old at this point in time. The view of biological history was still very much controlled by the church then and people's religious beliefs. We're dealing with a lot of biblical literalism. Most people in Europe didn't have any concept of what the world looked like, what prehistory was, other than this idea of there was darkness and then God created the heavens and the earth.
And the idea at the time really was that the earth was only a few thousand years old.
Yes. There was very much 4,000 to 6,000 year olds, maybe depending on whose reckoning you were going with. So this was what everyone believed. They thought that the world had always been the way that it was. And that extended also to animals and the fossils that they were uncovering. Most people didn't even have a concept of extinction or evolution at this point in time. They believed that all animals on the earth had always existed in their natural state and that they never died off. Because that would imply that God's creation was not perfect, that there had been a mistake. If an animal couldn't survive, if it disappeared, then God had made a mistake somewhere.
And anything that was weird, like these curiosities that you couldn't explain, those just belonged to some animals that were living somewhere on Earth, but just not here.
Right. So even if you found what they thought was, say, an alligator skull in England, well, that just meant that it wasn't a dinosaur. It wasn't some strange animal that doesn't exist anymore. It had just moved somewhere else. It was south. It was in a new place. It was living deep under the sea. And we just didn't know where it was.
Well, you have to understand, though, just recently in this time frame, the Duck-Billed Platypus had been discovered in Australia. And talk about strange. These strange things being in the ground and being around was not an unusual idea.
That's part of what makes Mary Anning's work so interesting and revolutionary is that she, as she was finding these fossils and trying to think about them, she started imagining what a prehistoric world could look like that was different from their current world. And many of her discoveries, which we're going to go over in a second, actually created the basis for people to begin thinking of what that prehistoric world looked like. In fact, we even have a painting. A more ancient Dorset is a watercolor from 1830 that was painted by Henry de la Beche, and it's based on these fossils that she found. And it's the really cool thing about it is it's an image where you can see the sea, you see the shore, and you see animals both above and below the water. It's actually the first pictorial representation of a scene from deep time that's based on fossil evidence and also shows that above water and underwater at the same time.
Called the aquarium view.
Yes, exactly. And it's a really fascinating image of all these different animals living together with these giant plants and different creatures in the sky. And we've got to realize, even though for us that's commonplace, this is not how people imagined history. They imagined the same animals living together constantly, and sea monsters, strange anomalies, were just living somewhere we couldn't see anymore, but they still existed in this world.
Well, what type of creatures did she discover?
Let's
talk about the discoveries that she did make and why they were so important.
Like we discussed, 1811. Remember, Charles Darwin was only 2 years old when this happens. Her brother finds the skull of what would later be called an ichthyosaur. Am I saying that right?
Ichthyosaur?
Ichthyosaur?
I mean, there's a couple of different pronunciations.
I'm so horrible with dinosaur names. My kids are always correcting me because they watch Dinosaur Train. I can't get it right.
Yay for Dinosaur Train.
Right?
I believe it's ichthyosaur.
It's this...
Most of the time. It's kind of a dolphin-looking creature.
Okay,
Crossed
kind
with
of
a shark.
Kind of.
Yeah, it's kind of an elongated skull. And when they found it, they thought it was a crocodile. And they weren't really paying much attention to it.
Well, what they found, Joseph actually found it first. He found the skull itself in about 1811, shortly after their father's death. But he couldn't find the rest of the animal. However, he told Mary where he'd found this skull, and she and her dogged determination kept going back and back until she uncovered the entire rest of the skeleton. It was about 17 feet long.
And it was pretty clear at that point they were not dealing with a crocodile.
Right, right, exactly. Now, it was initially identified as a crocodile, but Mary Anning recognized that this was not a crocodile, that this was an ichthyosaur. Now, it was purchased by the lord of the local manor, who then passed it on to a scientist in London for display. And that's where the word started to kind of spread, that there was something exciting, something different going on here.
It was the first big sale. It's where the news started getting out. Think of it like an artist who is struggling and suddenly sells a piece to a major collector, and suddenly everyone wants to know where it came from.
Well, once this went on display, scientists started writing papers about it.
I mean, people were paying admission to come and see it. Mm-hmm. People were writing papers about it.
Now, the papers never mentioned who found the fossil, who collected it initially.
But that was in the pattern of the time. Because obviously, men were the ones who could do this important research.
Also emphasizing the scientists who were reviewing the skeleton, and why would the lower class woman who dug it up, why would they assume that she had anything valuable to contribute?
Now, eventually, this ichthyosaur skeleton was purchased by the British Museum in 1819 and put on display there. The skull, if you ever want to go see it, is at the Natural History Museum in London now. The rest of the skeleton is missing.
So if you don't know where.
Yeah, if you have a chest in your attic or something and you find an ichthyosaur skeleton,
that could be good for you.
Yeah,
we'd like to hear about it. Give us a call,
please.
Yeah.
So what other skeletons did...
We know that 13 years later, in 1824, she found the first, I'm going to butcher this, plesiosaurus. Mm-hmm. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Woohoo! Plesiosaurus skeleton, and those are very long-necked dinosaurs.
Yeah. In contrast to the ichthyosaur that looks more like a modern dolphinish kind of thing, the plesiosaurus had a very, very long neck. She actually discovered a partial skeleton a few years earlier, but it was missing the skull. 1824, she did discover this full skeleton of the plesiosaurus. Well, it might have even been 1823. There's a little bit of dispute over
somewhere in that range.
1823, 1824. But again, the discovery was not credited to Mary Anning. It was credited to the scientists, the collectors that purchased it from her.
1824 was also another discovery of hers.
Yes, and this one makes me giggle. There had been for a long time a scientific question about bezoars, what were called bezoars. Now these were these strange conical objects that were found kind of mixed in with the skeletons of some of these strange creatures, and they were often found in kind of the lower abdomen area. And there were all these theories about what they could possibly be, but Mary Anning is the one who actually started dissecting them and discovered that they often contained fossilized fish bones and scales, and sometimes bones from other ichthyosaurs. Her theory, that proved to be true, was that they were fossilized feces. Fossilized ichthyosaurus poop.
Which she actually thought to dissect and understand when no one else was even going there.
In this same pattern, she made this discovery. She shared it with another scientist. He renamed the objects coprolites and published a paper on it, and he got the credit for it. Of course. Mm-hmm. Now I have to throw in a little Harry Potter trivia here. Because I've been reading the Harry Potter books out loud to my 3 boys. And we are in the 6th book, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, right now. If you know anything about the storyline, Harry has never been very good in his potions
Spoiler
class.
alert!
Yes.
Spoiler alert! But the book has been out for like 10 years, so read it already.
Way more than that,
Seriously,
actually.
folks, read it already.
So, Harry has never been very good with potions, but he happens to find this potions textbook that has been scribbled in the margins and changes made to some of the potion recipes, and all of a sudden he's following all these suggestions and he's amazing at potions. Well, one little thing that he learns from the scribbled notes in the margins is that a bezoar is considered a universal antidote for almost all poisons. And this knowledge comes in very, very handy a little bit later in the book when his best friend Ron is accidentally poisoned by a bottle of a drink meant for somebody else. So he rushes over and he finds the bezoar in the cabinet and stuffs it down Ron's throat and saves the day.
Fossilized dinosaur poop.
Right. But perhaps if they'd realized realized exactly what a bezoar was, they wouldn't have been quite as excited about shoving that down their
But that's
throat.
also a really cool example of how Mary Anning's work, didn't just affect the paleontology field, the geology field. We're seeing her work show up in places we don't even realize. Like Harry Potter. How cool is
Harry
that?
Potter.
It fills my geek
really.
heart with glee.
Absolutely.
So, bezoars.
Now, in 1820, they were in pretty dire financial straits. And at that point, one of the collectors who they had sold several of their fossils to, named Lieutenant Colonel Thomas James Birch,
Who had been collecting a lot of her fossils.
yes, he became kind of disturbed. He became upset that they were so poor. He was worried about them. They hadn't made any major discoveries for a little while, and so they were at the point of having to sell their furniture in order to make the rent. So he decided, out of the goodness of his heart, to auction the fossils that he had purchased from them on their behalf. Held this auction at Bullock's in London in 1820 and raised about £400 for them. Wasn't able to find exactly how much went to the Annings, but it put them on a better financial footing. And at the same time, it also increased their exposure. People saw these amazing fossils, these discoveries that were being auctioned, and all of a sudden they had people coming from Paris and Vienna and wealthy collectors from all over Britain coming to see what they had to offer.
And to actually go out in the field with her to find fossils.
So even though she wasn't getting credit for what she was doing, people knew who she was, and she was in demand.
Especially people in the field.
Yep, very much. And that had a big impact because by the mid-1820s, her economic situation was really starting to change.
She had saved enough by 1826 to actually purchase a sturdier home that included a glass-fronted store.
That's huge at the time.
Their initial house that they lived in was so close to the shore that it frequently flooded. At one point, they had to climb out upper story window and onto the roof to prevent being drowned. So,
Wow.
yeah, this was a definite step up.
Wow, but it took them 20 years to get to that point.
Pretty much.
Wow.
She had some more discoveries. In 1828, she found the first...
Pterosaur.
It's one of those bird-like things.
Now,
That was outside of Germany.
Yes. Now, as any dinosaur aficionado knows,
So, like my 8-year-old.
right, the creatures that were in the water were not dinosaurs. They were large marine reptiles. The creatures that flew were also not dinosaurs. They were pterosaurs. It was just the land creatures that qualified as dinosaurs. But yes, she discovered the first pterosaur outside of Germany, and that was in 1828, I believe. Oh,
And that was followed 2 years later with the... I'm going to let
Okay.
you say this one.
I'm lost on this one too. Squaloraja, maybe? It was a fossil fish that was kind of halfway between a shark and a ray. So she made these pretty incredible paradigm-shifting discoveries.
And they also helped her because these discoveries also were the ones that brought in the most money. Because the regular little mollusk and other fossils, common, and so they didn't get that much of a price for it. But these ones that we mentioned, they brought in the real money.
And she was finding full skeletons. She was finding new creatures that hadn't been identified before. And that was big business. It was valuable to people in a certain field, both from an academic perspective and a financial perspective.
Now, one tragic note here. We mentioned before how dangerous this work was, how common landslides were and whatnot. Well, in 1833, Mary Anning barely escaped landslide herself. That did take her little dog's life. His name was Trey, and she commented in a letter to a friend that he was just at her feet when the landslide took him.
Oh,
It was very, very sad.
So she's putting her neck on the line here.
Oh, yes.
And not getting recognition. She's getting financial compensation. People know who she is, but she's still not the person. That also kind of shows why they wanted her so much. Because these scientists, these folks, they could go out and do the work, but they didn't want to. It was dangerous stuff to do. And honestly, the cost of learning how to do it was high and risky. She knew. She'd been doing this since she was a child. She knew how to do the work in a dangerous environment.
As a consequence of her fame, at least in the paleontology world, spreading, she corresponded with a lot of the leading scientists. She would discuss with them, and then, of course, they would take what she told them, and they would publish it, and they would get the credit. which we mentioned before. As a result, she became rather resentful of this.
Yeah. Can't imagine why.
In fact, she actually mentioned that in one of her letters to a friend. It got to the point where her reputation was as the princess of paleontology. But again, she didn't have the public recognition.
Well, and we want to point out, really, we're not exaggerating when we say leading scientists of the day. We're talking Henry de la Beche, William Buckland, Edward Pigeon, Georges Cuvier, Adam Sedgwick, Thomas Hawkins, Louis Agassiz, Roderick Murchison. I mean, these are the big names. These are the people who would lead to the creations of the British Museum and these other major institutions. These are the folks who were really defining what this area of science would be, and they were relying heavily on her work.
Now, she did get published once.
Once.
That was just an excerpt from a letter she wrote, basically telling...
The Magazine of Natural History, wasn't it?
The Magazine of Natural History, that they got it wrong on classifying one of their fossils.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's the only time she got published in a scientific journal. She did have letters published, but that was basically between her and the people that she's corresponding with.
And it was a very small detail. Her issue is that they had said that a new shark fossil was a new genus, and because it had different shaped teeth. And she wrote to them with a great deal of evidence saying, no, actually, I have found sharks with both of these kinds of teeth, so it's not a new genus. You simply don't know your fossils very well.
And that was one of the strengths that she had. She could identify, as they put it, what tribe each fossil belonged to.
And I will give them credit. They published her letter. They admitted they'd made the mistake because they knew what would happen if it got out that they hadn't corrected something that Mary pointed out to them. Their credibility would be shot.
We come now to 1835, and she is once again, she hasn't had any major finds in a long time, relying on those common fossils, and she's again in financial trouble.
But at this point, I mean, she's been communicating, she's been corresponding with these well-known scientists of the day, and she's really developed some good relationships with them. So her friend William Buckland persuaded the British Association for the Advancement of Science and the British government to give her an annuity of about £25 a year, which wasn't a fortune, but it gave her, at least a baseline.
Her basic needs could be taken care of for that.
Absolutely.
And we want to emphasize just how much of an outsider Mary was for the scientific community. Women in Britain weren't allowed to vote. They couldn't hold public office. They couldn't even attend university. And this new Geological Society of London didn't allow women to become members or even attend the meetings as guests. So Mary's work could be discussed there, but she literally couldn't even walk into one of these meetings.
Despite the fact that she knew more about fossils than anybody there, she was definitely an outsider, both as a woman, as a working class person. This was a very sexist and classist society.
And it was always going to be those male gentlemen geologists who were members of that society. They were the ones who were going to be able to publish those scientific descriptions. She literally did not have an outlet she could publish in. So even when she created these descriptions, the only outlet she had was to tell her customers about it because she couldn't get published. And when they did do it, they wouldn't even mention her name as a source because that wasn't required because she wasn't considered an academic source. It was this paradox, this catch-22 she was stuck in.
But at the same time, she really did gain the respect of these men. In addition to the annuity that these scientists went to bat for her to get, when she was diagnosed with cancer in 1846, the Geological Society raised money from its membership to help with her expenses. And then the Dorset County Museum made her an honorary member. I mean, these were high honors that were not generally given to women.
No. In fact, probably the best example of the respect that they had for her comes from her eulogy.
Which was written by Henry de la Beche, who was the same man who created that painting based off of her discoveries.
A well-known geologist and president of the Geological Society at the time. Now, the society did not admit women until 1904. Okay, and Mary Anning died in 1847. There you go.
Literally the first time that a eulogy was given for a woman. It says, I cannot close this notice of our losses by death without advertising that of one, who though not placed among even the easier classes of society, but one who had to earn her daily bread by her labor, yet contributed by her talents and untiring researches in no small degree to our knowledge of the great Annaliosaurians and other forms of organic life entombed in the vicinity of Lyme Regis.
And that is high praise, considering that at one point her success in acquiring the knowledge that she did was ascribed to divine favor. And that was by a woman.
A lot of times, as we're reading the story of Mary Anning and similar women, you go from the extreme that, well, these men made all the discoveries to, oh no, wait, over here, and she really did all the real work. But the real picture is more complicated than assigning responsibility to one or the other, or casting one group as the villains and the other person as the underappreciated hero. Is that really within the very restrictive rules of the time and social structure of that Regency and early Victorian period, was they were finding ways to make it work.
I'd like to read this quote from Lady Harriet Sylvester, who visited Mary Anning in 1824, and this is what she said. "The extraordinary thing in this young woman is that she has made herself so thoroughly acquainted with the science that the moment she finds any bones, she knows to what tribe they belong. She fixes the bones on a frame with cement and then makes drawings and has them engraved. It is certainly a wonderful instance of divine favor that this poor, ignorant girl should be so blessed, for by reading and application she has arrived to that degree of knowledge as to be in the habit of writing and talking with professors and other clever men on the subject, and they all acknowledge that she understands more of the science than anyone else in this kingdom."
How interesting is it they refer to her as an ignorant girl in the same paragraph, but that's also a sign of the classism going on here.
Very much so.
That idea of ignorance was tied to social graces, to knowledge of what was the polite world dealt with. So that even though she's an expert on this incredibly technical field they're dealing with, because she doesn't understand the rules of jokes, how to play whist at dinner, which fork to use, whatever their rules were of the time, she's considered ignorant.
Now, she's had somewhat of a revival in the last several years. She was the focus of 2 novels that came out, one in 2009 called Remarkable Creatures. I actually have it on hold at the library right now. Can't wait to read it. And one called Curiosity, released in 2010. She was voted in 2010 as one of the top 10 British women of science. Google had a Google doodle of her on her 215th birthday in 2014, and we'll have a picture of that on our website. It's kind of fun. She's right there, digging out another skeleton. Looks like a plesiosaur. And then, of course, there is the famous tongue twister. She sells seashells on the seashore. The shells she sells are seashells, I'm sure. So if she sells seashells on the seashore, then I'm sure she sells seashore shells.
Okay, she just did that without any editing, folks. No filter right there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well done.
That was actually written in, I believe, 1908, but, we'll claim it.
So what we want to emphasize here is we don't want to cast the members of the Geological Society of London as the villains who exploited Mary. A lot of times we want to look back on this and say, well, obviously they were horrible in exploiting her, not recognizing her work, but they were on a personal level. But they were functioning in this very restrictive social structure. So we don't want to cast them as villains, and also we don't want to cast her as someone who was completely unappreciated. It was a partnership, and the best partnership they could create given the social rules of the time. And that's also what I find really fascinating about Mary Anning, is that with those restrictions, she found a way to make the business work, to get her intelligence out. Even when she couldn't publish it, she found a way to sell it through those collections, through the fossils she was doing, by building that supplier relationship that made them dependent.
And her reputation.
Exactly.
She had an incredible reputation among the leading scientists of the day.
She used branding when she couldn't actually get direct access and equality.
One measure of her reputation was the fact that her eulogy that was given was only given to fellows of the society, the highest level. You had to be really spectacular to get an eulogy.
And it was written by the president of the society.
That's right. And the other really unique thing about her is that she found a way to make it pay. This was a time frame in which scientists had to be rich, because you didn't get paid for doing research.
And she basically found very, very wealthy patrons and made them dependent on her. And that's amazing branding, that's marketing, that's understanding supplier relationships. She did it better than they could do it themselves. So she was absolutely essential to them.
Now, one of our favorite discoveries as we were researching
I love this
for this episode is a delightful little song by a group called Artichoke, all about Mary Anning. We'll have the video embedded on our website so you can enjoy it as well.
And here's just a little sample.
So thank you for joining us to learn more about Mary Anning and her amazing discoveries that helped the field of geology and paleontology grow.
If you liked this episode, consider leaving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or social media. You can find Snark, updates, and behind-the-scene peeks of production on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business. Music for this podcast is from the album Time Within Itself by Michael Waldrop and used with permission of the artist. You can find out more about it on iTunes and Amazon. If you'd like to access show notes and multimedia content and the periodic rant from your hosts, be sure to visit our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com.